Roettgen is the managing partner of E2MC Ventures, a space-focused venture capital firm. He is also the author of, I don't know how to pronounce this, Roettgen. I'm guessing at that. You'll have to,
yeah.
Henas, okay. I don't know what that means. You're going to have to answer that. It's an introductory book on space business. He lectures on space entrepreneurship at several universities and hosts the Space Business Podcast. Both I and James Burke of the Moon Society were on his podcast in the last couple of weeks, so that was really fun. Raphael is a chartered financial analyst. He invests in space companies. He is the author, I just said that, the host of Space Business Podcast and contributing editor to Space Watch Global, also an ISU alum. He's a partner in Space for Impact and lectures on space finance and entrepreneurship at several universities. Thank you very much, sir. We're going to bring you on now. I'm going to be quiet. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you, Michael. So let me share my screen. A second. Okay, and by the way, it's great to see so many ISU people. So I actually quickly changed my shirt and put on my ISU swag here. In any event, so I titled my talk "Opening the Moon for Business," which I think we all want to do here. And if you're a science fiction fan like me, you may recognize the cover picture here. This is from the movie Ad Astra. This is depicting the moon base. And I mean, there's obviously many depictions of moon bases in science fiction, starting with, well, not starting with, but for example, as early as the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, Clavius Crater Base, right? But what I really want to point out here, I really like this picture, right? Because you see clear signs of commercial activity. If you zoom in a little bit, you can see, I'm pretty sure it's a DHL sign, right? The yellow sign in the middle. And then to the right of that, which I like even more, you have the cowboy, right? I think it's in the US, it's called Vegas Vic, right? Which is probably, I'm pretty sure, is some sort of like nightclub or bar or something like that. And I put this here because we probably all agree, well, I'm not sure we all agree, but probably many people think this is where we want to get to, right? This is the easy part, this is the end goal. The question is, how can we get there? You already went to my background, so I'm going to skip that. So what we have done so far, I mean, I think everybody here on this call, this type of conference knows we've done the so-called flags and footsteps missions, 6 successful moon landings, crewed moon landings, 12 people who walked on the moon, all male, all American. The longest time we spent on the moon surface, 75 hours, so really not a whole lot of time. And we brought absolutely everything that's necessary to survive there, mostly in the form of the lunar module. We've done even more uncrewed missions. I think just the US has done, I think, way over 30. The USSR has, and Russia have also landed on the moon, China as well. And a lot of other nations have either flown around the moon or tried to land, like recently Israel and India. Okay, but again, the flags and footsteps is what we had so far. There might be an intermediate step, which I would call like the research station type presence. And on the top here in the middle, you have the South Pole Research Station. And then I'm sorry, on the bottom, I couldn't find a good science fiction depiction of a research station on the moon. This is from the movie The Martian, as you probably know. And on the right, you have, again, a depiction of, from science fiction of what a future bigger lunar base could look like. This is from one of my favorite TV series, The Expanse. So you see the base on top, and on the bottom, sort of the type of activity I think we ultimately want to be able to enjoy on the moon as well, just having a nice drink with friends. But again, the question is, how do we get there? And so on this slide, I basically added to the same categories the type of people who would go on these missions. So flags and footsteps, there was obviously professional astronauts. For the research stations, presumably it would be scientists, maybe some service staff to run the station or protect the station, and possibly some high-end tourists. Of course, once we really get to a self-sustaining settlements, the idea is that we would have average people there, and that maybe tourists or maybe people who work in some sort of function on the moon. Okay, moving on, adding another aspect here. So what do we need for this different type of missions? For the flags and footsteps missions, we basically need that and still need a transport capability. Once you move to research stations where people may stay a little bit longer than the 75 hours, that was the longest time during the Apollo missions, well, we will need basic infrastructure, life support systems and so forth, we'll get to that. But then for the self-sustaining, sustained presence, we really need a reason to come and ideally to stay. And we'll talk about that. So let's go through all of these different elements. So starting with the transfer capability, and I'm pretty optimistic. I mean, it looks pretty good. I mean, on the left, you have the recent Chinese, obviously uncrewed lunar lander that actually brought back a sample. And it seemed so routine, it seemed so easy the way they did that. And of course, on the right, and with apologies if there's anybody on the call from the national team or from Dynetics, but it's obviously the Lunar Starship. And yeah, excuse me, I'm a SpaceX fanboy, and may I say I also pay taxes in the US, so I'm a fan of the SpaceX Lunar Starship. And so I think, you know, as I believe many people on this call share this opinion, you keep on talking about the Starship singularity. This really would make a massive difference, the type of transport capability and capacity that Starship would represent to the lunar surface. So pretty optimistic on transport capability, to be honest. Okay, talking about basic infrastructure, starting with this slide, that's just reminding people that the moon is a harsh place, and this is why you need some special infrastructure. Actually, the distance, the travel time, and the communications latency, I'm less worried about. I'm a big fan of studying history. And if you go back to the time of the exploration of the Earth, or even like just some 200 or 300 years when we used to go to places like, let's say, England to Australia, well, that was a 6 months journey on a ship. And the communications delay was basically 6 months. So the moon with today's technologies, that's pretty good, actually. Of course, some of the other stuff is pretty harsh, really. Like there's no air, the water is in the form of ice, there's definitely no food there right now, and the temperature swings are pretty brutal. You're in a hard vacuum, there's lots of radiation, and there is microgravity, well, 1/6 gravity in the Earth. I put the mass values for reference as well, but I think probably most people on this call are familiar with these values anyway. But of course, because of this harsh environment, we need basic infrastructure if we want even an Antarctica-style research base there, right? We need energy. That's probably the most elementary need of them all, because that drives everything else. We will need environmental control and life support systems, or ECLIS as we call it. If you want to do anything more interesting, we will need communication systems, navigation systems. I forgot to put it on here, but probably a sort of systematic remote sensing capability around the moon so that we can observe things. Launch and landing facilities, spaceports, whatever you want to call them, or just pads, whatever. Habitats, well, kind of buildings, right? Habitats for where crew could live, or storage facilities for food, or greenhouses. Medical attention, because it is a few days back to Earth. So if there's an emergency, you will want to be able to at least take care of some medical emergencies. And that's actually the reason I put the picture on the left. That's sort of an interesting story that some of you may know. This is a Russian guy called Rogozov, who in the 1960s was at the Antarctic Research Station of the Soviet Union. And he was the only trained physician. He got appendicitis, so he had to self-operate. And so this is just to say that it's probably good to have some basic medical attention on the moon as well, which is a few days away from Earth. And the last point I put is it would be nice to have just the publicly available data on the moon. And this is why like efforts like the Moon Society's wiki, I think those are valuable efforts. Okay, so this is the infrastructure part. Let's move on to the next part. If we really want to sustain present, we need a reason to come and to stay. I'm going to start again with science fiction and an anti-example. This is from, again, if you know science fiction, this is from Man in Black 3, where you have a maximum security prison on the moon, but I think that's ideally not the use case we want, even though there is, of course, terrestrial precedent with the exploration of Australia. Let's talk about some other use cases, and many of those have been mentioned already so far by previous speakers. I mean, science is an obvious one. Testing, the moon as a testing ground for deep space. A staging location for other locations. I mean, it's just significantly easier to get off the moon surface than the Earth surface. It's much less of a gravity well. Natural resources has been mentioned a few times. I mean, there's obviously the water ice, which you can process into hydrogen and oxygen, which you can use as rocket fuel, an oxidizer, or we can use it for the oxygen for life support as well. And for this natural resource case, it's really quite interesting, right? Because again, that's where we look back at Earth's history, and we have a lot of precedent, a lot of settlement of certain regions in Earth originally occurred, at least helped by natural resources. So the various gold rushes, right? The California gold rush, the Klondike gold rush in the North Yukon, even including some very harsh regions. For example, there's an archipelago north of the polar circle, which is called Svalbard, originally settled as well for things including the exploration of natural resources. Tourism entertainment, and I put the example here of some people planning a remote controlled car race on the moon, but I think there could be many other examples, maybe sports and some other things. Funny enough, we just mentioned in the last, I think, discussion, the collector's items. And it's really interesting to think what else. We need a killer app for the moon. And of course, the pictures here, I already mentioned the car race, and on the left, it's the tourism example, right? That's Yusaku Maezawa, who paid SpaceX a lot of money, not disclosed, but you can sort of triangulate. It's probably in the hundreds of millions of dollars to do an Apollo 8 style mission on Starship in the next few years. Okay, another thing, it's not exactly infrastructure, but I'm going to mention it at this point because it sort of fits in. If we want investment and sustained presence on the moon, we also need, as an investor, I want to have sort of governance, so it's a stable business. And that can basically happen in a couple of ways. One is you have an agreed and accepted legal framework, but very importantly, and for example, like the Artemis Accords, but very importantly, you need an enforcement capability. Like one of my nationalities is Brazilian, and without picking too much on the Brazilians, we have a lot of laws. The problem is many of them are not enforced, and let me tell you, it doesn't work. So the laws are useless unless there's an enforcement capability, and maybe it's going to be Space Force, maybe it's going to be something else, but you do need the enforcement capability if you use that route. The other way to get to some sort of government/security, which I probably prefer because it's not dependent on governments, is just game theory. And that's to some extent the Wild West. And on the left here, you have the Mexican standoff scenario, right? It's just, I'm not going to do anything bad to you because if I do something bad, you're going to do something bad to me. And in the end, we will both lose out and both of our businesses will suffer. But a general point being here, a stable environment for business in terms of government security, that's important. Okay, coming back to the slides where we had the various types of missions and where we want to get to. Now, if you look at the last row, I basically, the last row here is meant to indicate where the financing is most likely to come from. So the flags and footsteps types missions, of course, it's mostly, if not exclusively, public money, government money. If it's a research station, it's probably mostly public. Maybe we have some public-private partnerships as commercial actors get interested in testing a few things, having minimal viable products, having proof of concepts, in anticipation of then a bigger lunar economy, which should really be driven mostly by private actors. And so let's look a little bit at what how private investors might be motivated. Of course, my main role, as Michael said in the introduction, is as a space venture investor, so I qualify for that. And so here I put the investment criteria we use internally at E2MC Ventures, which is a seed stage space investor. So it's not necessarily the best example for the moon, but in any event. So let me just quickly run through those. We look at the team, and the team, it's important for us that somebody knows what they're doing also on the technical side. So if we had to look at the moon company, we would want to have somebody who understands the moon aspects. But there are people like that around. Not too many, but we can find people like that. The second point is very complicated for the moon right now, which is the market potential, precisely because we don't know yet what the really viable commercial business cases on the moon are. Nothing is proven yet. So one slight way around that, I wouldn't say it's cheating, but it's a way around that, is that we sometimes look at is companies that have what I would call a dual use type business case, and not dual use in the usual sense we use it, like civil and military, but dual use in the sense that, well, maybe they make a product that will ultimately be very helpful on the moon, but we can also sell it to terrestrial customers in the meantime. And there's a few examples like that, like mining equipment or technology. That's obviously going to be case. We want to see that there is a through business model. The next one, exit potential, the big question mark at the moment for the moon. Ultimately, what could be the exit route, whether it's a sale or a listing for those companies. The execution plan, I'm going to come back on the next slide. The main problem there is the time frame for most lunar businesses. Moving over to the right column, de-risking elements. That could be, for example, the public sector supporting it in some way with non-dilutive financing or loan guarantees or being an anchor customer. And that's very, very important, I believe, for the moon, as many other speakers before me have already indicated, and I'll come back to that. A portfolio fit that's specific to our fund, so I won't go into detail on that. Our ability to add value is also specific to our fund. Co-investors is also less relevant. Positive impact and gut feel. Okay, so really the main problem here, if you look at our typical investor criteria, and the reason probably we haven't invested in any lunar company yet is, and that's probably, I suspect, similar for most other space investors like Michael on this call here as well, Michael Mealing, is the market potential and what's really a business case. Okay, in a similar vein, I put down some typical investor concerns when we talk about investing in space, and this is from our experience when we go fundraising as a venture fund as well, and try to convince potential investors to invest in our fund and in the space, and thereby in the space economy at large. I mean, it's deep tech, right? And that's just generally, some people are scared that they don't understand it, and that's fair. The second point is valid for Lunar, for many Lunar business models. They can be very capital intensive, of course. It costs a lot of money right now to take 1 kilogram to the moon. It still costs millions of dollars. The third bullet point we already mentioned, this is the long time frame to revenues and then to exit. And that's probably the case for pretty much any Lunar business we can think of right now. And keep in mind, you may or may not know this, but for like a fund like ours, a venture fund, most venture funds, sort of the upper end of the lifetime of the fund is 10 years. And I mean, there's 1 or 2 funds out there which have 15 years, but that's then really the upper end for what typically be 7 to 10 years. So, and really, ideally, you wouldn't want to be able to exit your investments in that time frame again. Otherwise, it gets complicated. And this is another complication when we talk about Lunar business models. Certainly, scarcity of successful exits today that used a general bullet point concern people had about generally the space sector. Recently, that's gotten a little bit better, largely thanks to SPACs. But certainly, since we haven't seen any Lunar companies SPAC yet, arguably, it's still a concern here. And the last bullet point, that's actually not relevant for Lunar companies. Okay, so the question is then, what can be done given this reality that I just laid out and these various concerns? What can be done to still incentivize private investment on the moon? For me, and this has, again, I'm not the first one to mention it at this conference, it's about de-risking as much as possible. So, and this could be, and de-risking, this will be mostly by governments and government entities, right? It doesn't have to be, but probably mostly. So, for example, providing and financing the basic infrastructure we talked about. Like, most basic example would be like an energy and life support infrastructure. Providing a business-friendly framework. So this is what we talked about, a legal framework or an enforcement capability. Acting as an anchor customer. Also, other speakers have already mentioned it. Acting as a co-investor. And providing any sort of other incentives, tax credits, favorable labor laws, maybe some sort of regulatory arbitrage. You're allowed to do something on the moon that maybe on Earth in certain places you're not allowed to do. I'm not talking about really bad examples, but just something maybe that on Earth people wouldn't want it in their backyard, but on the moon the backyard is much bigger. Subsidies, and maybe we should think about something like a lunar development zone where we basically combine some of these incentives, and then encourage you to think of what else we could do there. And once though, because I'm very much a free markets guy, once the governments have provided this de-risking, I also very much believe they should get out of the way and just let entrepreneurs do their thing, because usually that works. Okay, and so who can help with all of this? And this is mostly focused on sort of also where can the financing come from? And of course, governments in their various forms, whether it's space agencies, military agencies, or other entities. That's obviously a key one. It could be multinational entities, like we have the European Space Agency here in Europe. We talked a lot about public-private partnerships already. There could also be private consortia. There could be individual private actors who just really want to use their wealth. And that could be companies or individuals who want to use their wealth to advance the lunar economy. Or the crowd, like really people at large, retail investors, many, many people combined. And I put a few pictures here on the right, basically to give some examples, since you may know some of them. On the top, that's one of the dams of. All right, so the big five, this is from the history of Hawaii. Those were basically sugar barons, and they arguably contributed a lot to the development of the islands because they had this business interest in sugar. It's probably a controversial example because they also exerted a lot of political influence, were probably a cartel, but I put it here anyway as an example of a private consortium helping to develop a geographic place. On the left, the thing in sort of the light brown, you may be able to read it. It's a stock certificate of something called the South Sea Company, which was a listed stock in the UK in the early 18th century, the peak around 1720. And it's an example of several bubbles we had in the early stock markets, which were all companies where people got really excited about exploration on Earth of a certain region. So the South Sea Company, and this is going to be a really sort of like politically bad example, they actually got a monopoly on the slave trade to certain islands. But there's other examples. There's something called the Mississippi Company. And as the name implies, this was a lot about the Mississippi region and specifically about Louisiana. And there was also something called the Bengal Company, which, as the name implies, was about the exploration of the Bengal region in India. And all three of those stocks went through massive bubbles. On the South Sea Company, Sir Isaac Newton, space connection, he lost most of his wealth in that bubble when it burst in the end. But this is just to say, people, in the end, retail investors can get very excited about these opportunities, pour in a lot of money. And remember, that money may not be lost. It may actually get invested in those projects, and those projects may leave behind assets, developed assets, which are valuable for those regions. And of course, we've already mentioned the SPACs right now. I'm not saying for a moment that the SPACs are a bubble, but I mean, certainly it's fair to say that the SPACs have generated, the 11 SPAC announcements we've had since Virgin Galactic have generated over $5.5 billion of financing inflow into the space sector. And the last thing on the lower right here is just for fun. A few years ago, I wrote an article arguing we should issue a Mars cryptocurrency to help develop the basic infrastructure on Mars. I put here as the last bullet point that the key is to actually educate all of these groups, governments, private actors, companies, retail investors, and I'll come back to that because I really believe that. Okay, here quickly is something we developed internally at E2MC, my fund, recently, to explain to people why the space sector is in such a good moment right now. And if you start on the left, we think there have been some elements which really gave the impulse to the new space economy. And this was a combination, we believe, of government support, the government really doing partnerships with commercial actors, giving out large contracts like commercial resupply, and of course now with the moon eclipse. And cost decreases via technology, so reusable rockets, CubeSats, and other things. And those initial impulses basically meant that suddenly a lot of business models became much more financially, economically viable than before, and some of them successful. That caught the attention of investors who started pouring in more investment money into space, but also of talent, of people who thought, well, maybe I should be a space entrepreneur. And both of these things have effects. You get the entrepreneurs coming into the space sector, you get the money coming, and that money that doesn't remain idle, right? This additional investment, it gets used for something, mostly for further research and development or for scaling up operations. If it's further R&D, it'll probably improve the technology even further. If it's used for scaling up, it's going to improve the economies of scale. Either one of those two will mean that economics improve even further, making the business models and new business models even more economically viable. And then you go into a vicious circle. And this is really, hopefully, the really positive virtuous circle we're in right now in new space in general. But I do believe, and so I've taken the same slide and modified it for the lunar economy, that we can have a similar thing with the lunar economy right now, that if we do it right, let's create a virtuous circle. And if you start again on the left, two elements. One would be sort of the actions by government. And again, the more they can de-risk it for private actors, the better. And then, of course, we have technological innovations as well. And the one we keep coming back to is what we call the Starship Singularity. And then with those two impulses, hopefully we could start the same virtuous circle of more and more business models becoming viable on the moon. And of course, there's also network effects between various business models, which is not even portrayed on this page. So in summary, what I would encourage all of us to do, right, is things like educate as many people as possible about the moon, because the various people, the investors, the politicians, the retail investors, they can't do anything if they don't understand the moon, right? So get them excited, be optimistic. As a venture investor, I'm always optimistic. I'm always thinking about, well, what if something works? And less thinking about, well, what if it doesn't work, right? Because I'm much more worried about missing something really, really big than something going wrong. Something goes always wrong in venture investment. That doesn't mean we have to be naive and blue-eyed. Of course, we shouldn't do stuff that's stupid, that's obviously bad, like, you know, thinking that 200 launch companies will work out. But generally, we should be optimistic, because if we're pessimistic, we're never going to get anybody excited to help in lunar development. And so let's help to get that flywheel started that I just described and create a self-fulfilling prophecy of the lunar economy. And remember, the best way to predict the future is to help create it. And so I stop here, and hopefully that wasn't too much overtime, and happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Raphael. Appreciate that. And it did go better after you switched networks, so that was helpful. Leave that screen up for a second. We only have a few minutes. We're actually a mild bit over time, but the flywheel. Go back to the flywheel for a second. Yeah. So what kinds of things, I believe that you haven't made any investments at all that are lunar focused businesses. Is that right?
That's correct. We are currently in the final stages of looking at one of those businesses that I described as a potential dual use business, which the product would absolutely have a very important use on the moon. But the reason we are able to invest in it is because we think the same product can be sold and sold a lot on Earth as well.
Okay, so is that your criteria? Is that you have your clients, your say portfolio companies, they have to be able to make money now in the real world, not some futuristic version where they're mining ice, for example?
Well, I think that there has to be revenue. At the end of the day, we need to get ideally a good exit for our investors within the lifetime of the fund. And I mean, yes, there's a way we can stretch that. We can extend our fund by 1 or 2 years. We could sort of sell an investment from our current fund into a successor fund. But typically, you want to be able to exit within the fund's lifetime. So that means in many cases, there should obviously be revenues or profits, or at least the company advances in some other way. Maybe it's a low TRL company, but during the lifetime of the fund, it has such obvious advances in TRL that it starts getting a lot more. It starts building its customer book. It gets basically contracts. It may get more non-dilutive financing, so that value is crystallized in some other way.
Great, that is much more clear. I think it is safe to say that it is hard to be a moon business. It is hard to raise money for being a moon business. And that's not going to change anytime soon, right?
Yeah, the typical problem, Michael, is right now, and you notice is, so there's obviously some companies which have, for example, received very large contracts, right? I think we mentioned Astrobotics before, and there are several contracts. I think the largest one is almost $200 million.
Yeah.
The question to all of these companies that investors always will pose is, well, what comes after the contract?
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. What happens if...
I mean, you have some of my VC colleagues who are less charming than me, and they basically, one of them has the tagline like, "You're not a company, you're a contract."
Yeah. No, it happens. It happens. All right, sir. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. We are gonna move on to our next speaker.
Pleasure.
Appreciate you being here. Thank you.